You're listening to GWP Live. Today is January 20th, 2026 on a Tuesday. And we are bringing you live, up-to-date winter weather updates. So, Jake, what are things looking like? What's coming our way in terms of winter weather?
Yeah, so we're still watching that potential for a winter storm that could impact us across Missouri. We talked about this in last night's weekly news update during the weather segment here. We could be looking at some major impacts and likely will somewhere across the central U.S. It's just a little bit unclear of the exact location and timing, but we are starting to get a better understanding of that. And so as we continue to get a better understanding of that, we're going to continue to bring it to you. And that's what we're doing here today.
Absolutely. So we are bringing live, up to date winter weather coverage here on GWP Live again throughout the winter as those severe weather conditions come about. GWP Live, again, GWP News, the more routine weather updates that we do there will be your home for all of that information and much more. So if you haven't tuned in the past, want to check that out. Of course, here on GWP Live, what sort of sets this apart, aside from the obvious that we are delivering information here live, is that, well, if you have any questions, anything you'd like to contribute to this, certainly any sort of burning questions, things you'd like to know about the weather. Are you going to be all right? Well, never fear, you can call in. We'll give you the most up-to-date information, personalized as best we can. If you just call in, give us a call, 417-448-0819. Again, that number is 417-448-0819 for all those burning questions amid all this winter weather. Jake?
Yeah, so again, make sure to call that number if you do have those questions or want us to maybe even discuss something else related to the matter. But that being said, we'll go ahead and without any further calls or questions, we'll go ahead and we'll start looking at what we're dealing with here. And so here is a current look at those weather alerts that we have brought to you here by the National Weather Service. That's courtesy of the National Weather Service. And so you'll notice that we do have winter storm watches that have now been issued across Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. This is where we're expecting for the worst of the ice and the snow. The ice a little bit further to the south across Texas and Louisiana, and then that snow potential across Oklahoma and also into Arkansas. Some areas looking at over a foot of snow across Oklahoma and Arkansas, potentially looking at record snowfall across these locations. We could be setting daily records or 2 day records across these areas. Those winter storm watches have been issued, and the important thing here when we're dealing with any sort of winter storm watch here, so you can see the color code down here for all of the different alerts here. But this right here is that winter storm watch that we mentioned here. We've also got those cold weather advisories and extreme cold watches across the Dakotas and into Minnesota and Wisconsin tonight, where we are expecting those wind chills to be well below zero, frostbite in as little as 30 minutes across these areas are possible. That the worst of the cold, the most dangerous cold, is still yet to come with this weekend storm system.
Absolutely. So, a couple of states here in our four-state area already under that winter weather warning. Of course, not including Missouri, Kansas, but Oklahoma and Arkansas, it would appear, are under that winter weather warning, expecting a fair bit of snow. So, certainly for any of those in that area, it'd be worth noting. Naturally, as always, amid those weather conditions, certainly when the snow is coming down, you'll want to take some extra caution in driving on those roadways, certainly in freezing conditions. Of course, ice is about the worst, as we mentioned many times previously on GWP News and all the rest. That is among some of the worst, some of the most dangerous driving conditions, but snow certainly poses its own hazards none the rest. Jake?
Yes, so again, those winter storm watches means that hazardous travel conditions are possible. If that is upgraded to a warning, then that means that it's expected. So we'll have to see if those watches do get upgraded to warnings. But the good news is here across the state of Missouri, we don't have any of those. And so that indicates that a lot of this activity is going to stay to our south, which includes that crippling ice threat. Now we'll look here at the latest run here of just kind of a general overview of the country, and then we will kind of zoom into specific locations here. And so, of course, we've got some snow ongoing over the next couple of days. That colder air is going to move in Thursday night. So we've got a couple more warm days expected above freezing temperatures. Like today was pretty nice. We were in the low 40s here in Columbia. Expected to see that again across Missouri for Wednesday and Thursday. But then into Friday, the colder air is going to come in. The winds are also expected to pick up just slightly, which is going to elevate that risk for that wind chill. And then again, the freezing precipitation is expected. Many areas across Texas and Louisiana expecting to start off with rain, but then transitioning into ice, sleet, and snow. And then that's really going to start to accumulate. Here's midnight on Sunday morning. You can see it really taking into effect really across the deep south. But according to this model, not really affecting us here in Missouri. And so that's why those winter storm watches are not really issued here. But regardless of if this storm does play out the way that it looks like it possibly will across the state of Missouri, we know for sure that we will get dangerously cold wind chills upwards of 20 degrees below zero by Saturday and Sunday morning, with actual temperatures sitting around zero to just a little bit below zero.
Absolutely. You mentioned, of course, we're not receiving the worst of it, at least not yet here in Missouri. We are seeing it a bit south of us, immediately there, just in Arkansas and Oklahoma, Jake. And you'll certainly know more about this than I will, but this seems to be quite the weather cycle that we're in. Again, something of a spectacle, a bit unusual as far south that is, as some of this winter weather is occurring. I heard even recently, as far south as Florida, they're getting some snow, which is somewhat unusual to say the least.
Yeah, there was a few areas in southern Georgia over the weekend that picked up about 3 inches. That was kind of on the higher end of things. Of course, last year we also had this unusual setup play out as well. New Orleans set a daily snowfall record of 8 inches. It was actually tomorrow. From last year, so January 21st in 2025, when they set that all-time snowiest day on record. And so it's quite interesting that the same week that we had one of the biggest winter storms ever across the Gulf Coast, we're dealing with another southern system during that same week the following year. So kind of an interesting story, I guess you could say.
Absolutely, very interesting story to note, of course, and it wasn't entirely just all of a sudden. Of course, we've seen something kind of like this in the past year. So, certainly, though, of course, still what somewhat unexpected for that area, this degree of winter weather that far south. Jake, and what do you make of this? Do you think it's part of a larger weather trend?
I don't necessarily know that it affects a whole lot as far as that. There are sometimes a few years in a row where we see the same type of weather play out. And so then sometimes that makes us question if that is, some sort of a sign. Like, I think it's interesting that several years in the last 10 to 15 years, we've had category 4 and 5 hurricanes that have made landfall on the Gulf Coast on the last week of August. It seems like every last week of August, there's always some sort of tropical system. And so some people could say that that's a trend, but then we have some years where that doesn't occur. And so I don't necessarily know that that is the case, but I will say that there are times of the year where things are more likely to occur. And it appears that mid to late January is a time when the South is more likely to get snow if they do end up seeing wintry weather. But to have two back-to-back years across this region is a little bit unusual.
Absolutely. So we won't read too much into it, Jake, as you mentioned, as it's not entirely unheard of, unheard of. But we won't rule it out either. Again, could possibly be part of a trend. Certainly, though, they're just worth noting that while it might seem this way, certainly somewhat unusual to receive this amount of snow as far south. In this case, even in Florida, it's not entirely unheard of and not entirely out of the blue. We saw something somewhat similar in the past year. Jake?
Yes, certainly. And so now I think we'll go ahead and we'll start to kind of look at the different models and kind of see what we're expecting here, particularly across Missouri, but we'll also reference some of those other hard hit places, or at least areas that we're expecting to get hit pretty hard this weekend. And so, first of all, this is courtesy of Tropical Tidbits. Again, tropicaltidbits.com is where you can find all of the latest when it comes to these forecast models. And of course, we're going to be looking at three different models. We've got the GFS, the CMC, and the European model. And then we're going to do some comparing as far as where the storm track is going to be and how that could affect the storm and why there's still so much uncertainty in those snowfall amounts. And so we'll start here with the GFS model. Each of these models, we're going to be starting at 6 a.m. on Friday mornings. That's where we're starting, 6 o'clock in the morning, local time on Friday. And you'll notice that we have some rain across Texas, and then the ice begins to take into effect Friday night. This is probably where we'll have the worst of the impacts in Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi. Will be that window of Friday night into Saturday. That's when the heaviest precipitation is going to be is on Saturday, some of those heavier snowfall rates. But what you'll notice here in Missouri is that aside from a few counties to our south of Interstate 44, we don't really have any accumulations. And so, again, the good news is that none of the models are predicting ice here in the state of Missouri. That's the positive because that is what leads to the most power outages typically. But again, it's more of will we get snow or will this be a dry system? That remains to be the really big question. And then Sunday it begins to clear out and then it moves further towards the east. So, as far as those amounts go, we're starting to get a better idea of how much accumulation we're looking at across the Red River Valley, Texas, and Oklahoma. Then you go into southern and central Arkansas, looking at probably, I would say, some areas will pick up over a foot, potentially getting closer to 2 feet of snow across those areas. According to this model, maybe a dusting to an inch across Joplin, and then a little bit more across southern Missouri. And so now we're going to look at the European model, once again, starting at 6 a.m. on Friday Central Time across the South Central region. Rain develops across Texas in the morning. Friday night, that colder air moves in, and then the ice begins to develop across Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas. And as you'll notice, the European model is a little bit different. It has the storm tracking a little bit further to the north. I will say the interesting thing about this is the European and the GFS models have both been trending a little bit further to the north, which would potentially boost up our snowfall totals just a little bit. The storm would have to take a more northern track in order for that to occur. And then you'll notice into Saturday, that's when the snow would develop here from Joplin to Nevada, even into Columbia, a little bit of light snow to the north of I-70, but the majority of it would stay south of I-70 according to that European model. Again, all of that ice stays to our south, which means the power outage threat is mainly going to be from Texas over to Alabama. And then as we go into Sunday, this is actually it says Sunday right here, but this is Saturday night at 9 p.m. That's when it would clear out according to the European model. The European model right now is showing about 1 to 3 inches across the central part of Missouri, about 3 to 5, maybe even a little bit higher across southern Missouri is expected. And then one final model that we'll compare, which is the CMC model here, once again starting at that same timestamp of 6 a.m. on Friday morning Central Time. And you'll notice that this model has it going a little bit further to the south in the beginning, which means we wouldn't have as much snow here across Missouri. But then it takes a more northern track as we go into Saturday night. And so then that would allow for those light accumulations. The CMC forecasting very similar snowfall totals to what we saw from the European model, but a little bit lower than what the European model because the model is a little bit further to the south compared to the European model. But still, that ice is expected from Texas over to Alabama. And so we're pretty confident at this point in time from Texas to Alabama that there will be a significant ice accumulations anywhere from a half an inch to possibly over an inch of ice. And so that is crippling ice. We could be dealing with widespread power outages. And I would not be surprised if across this region, if some areas went 3 to 5 days without seeing power.
Absolutely. So certainly worth noting, Jake, as you mentioned, some more of that possible cooling trend further south. But in terms of what we're expecting here in Missouri, in terms of what really matters, a lot of that really difficult precipitation in terms of ice, certainly being among those that have the most devastating effects. Looks like we won't be getting a ton of it, fortunately. So, in terms of some of those damages, pipes freezing up, again, car accidents, different things like that, not going to complain about missing out on those things. Certainly, Jake, and it's interesting, as you mentioned, going through some of these different weather models, just the degree and difference sometimes that there can be across some of these different models, and something you've mentioned in the past. Of course, across these different models, there seems to be a decent amount of variety. In particular, the further out you're making these predictions. Again, as you mentioned previously, a considerable margin of error.
Yeah, certainly so. I mean, I mentioned on that European model, the snow was shown to be leaving at about 9 o'clock Saturday. This is 6 a.m. Sunday, so considerably later, according to this model, compared to what the European model. This model is even showing a little bit of snow across New Mexico and Texas on Sunday. And so that's kind of an interesting difference as well. And here's a look at those snowfall totals. This includes ice and sleet, or well, this actually just includes snow and sleet. This model in particular goes a little bit lighter on the accumulations and slightly more to the north. The GFS model was more northern Texas, southern Oklahoma. This one is like far northern Texas into central Oklahoma and into central Arkansas. And the amounts are also a little bit lower. This model predicting up to a foot instead of a couple of feet, according to the GFS model. This one shows anywhere from about 3 to 5 inches across southwest Missouri, and then about 2 to 4 here across Columbia. So that's according just to that one model. But Isaac, as you did mention, there's a lot of room for error. And now that since we are still about 3 days, 3 to 4 days out from this forecast, and so I want to show these three different models at the same time of a particular day. So this is 6 a.m. on Saturday, according to the GFS model. And you'll notice that we'll just take one spot here on the model, and you'll notice this line here that says 1034. You notice where it says 1034. So then we can track that, and there's a little bit of a dip right here. So we can almost say that it's going that far in on the winds. And so that's the position of the storm on the GFS model. The European model, same time of day, 6 a.m. on Saturday, has that 1034 at about right here across southwestern, almost into western central Oklahoma. And then the CMC model is right around the Texas-Oklahoma border, kind of positioned a little bit in the middle. So at 6 a.m. Saturday, here's the different positions of that one particular spot of the storm. And you'll notice that there's a significant difference as far as distance goes. And so that's how big of a difference there is between these three main models as far as the positioning of the storm track. And the storm track is going to make all the difference of whether or not we see snow here in Missouri. If it takes a more southern track like the GFS model, that would cause that northern edge of the snow to cut off around the Arkansas-Missouri border, therefore sparing us from any precipitation. But if you follow the CMC or the European model, that shifts everything up to the north, which means that the edge of the snow, instead of being along the Arkansas-Missouri state border, that would be here across Interstate 70, including all of us here across Southwest Missouri and me here in Columbia. And again, if you take the distance between where the GFS model and the European model, the difference is 210 miles. And again, this is part of the problem with going out 4 days into the forecast, is the margin for error is about over 200 miles, which means anywhere along this, like anywhere between that spot from 210 miles is where the storm track could end up being. That's about the distance if you were to draw a straight line from Tulsa, Oklahoma, all the way through Kansas City. That's about the kind of distance that you'd be looking at, not taking into effect roads, just drawing a straight line from point A to point B. It would be 210 miles. So quite interesting, the difference that we're dealing with.
Absolutely. So, as we mentioned, there quite a wide margin for error, certainly in terms of distance there. You saw just moments ago, great visual on your screens, a map to sort of put that all into perspective. Again, that number being roughly 210 miles. So it'll be interesting to follow these weather cycles and see exactly what happens, which one is the most accurate. So, Jake, in your experience, which one tends to be the most accurate? Does it vary a little bit based on the time of the year? Or is one consistently more accurate than the others?
So, from my personal experience of tracking these systems, which goes back about maybe 8 to 10 winters, probably I would say I've tracked these since about 2016. Um, Normally, what I've seen is that usually it takes the more northern track, just a little bit further to the north. And part of that has to do with these models tend to over exaggerate how far south that colder air is going to go. And so that means that they also exaggerate just a little bit how far south the storms are going to go. So I would say about 70-ish% of the time, they usually go just a little bit further to the north or exactly in the middle. So the middle or to the north is about 70% of the time. And then tracking to the south, that happens maybe 20 to 30% of the time, I would say.
Absolutely. So, very interesting point there. Again, I couldn't have told you any of that. So, that's some great information there. So, it seems, Jake, you say that in the past, the trend is for things to be further north, if not at it, fairly in line with where the prediction is. But again, they seem to get a bit overexcited, overestimate a bit how far south these things are going to go. Now, in terms of which model that is, do they have common patterns that they follow in terms of which one predicts these weather cycles going the furthest south, or does it vary? Is there not necessarily a single answer on that in terms of which is the most accurate, in terms of which is the sort of the northernmost predictions in terms of weather cycles and their effects? Jake?
Well, personally, I have to say that the GFS model does tend to overestimate snowfall totals. They, if I recall, were on the higher side of things with the snowfall forecast this past weekend in the south, and then that didn't really end up happening. And so I will say that in my past experience, I have seen the GFS model overestimate things, and that model is forecasting the most snow out of any of the models, especially further to the south. And so that is something that we have to look at. And that's part of the reason why I would say it's probably on the lower end of things from what these models are showing. The GFS model showing 2 feet of snow. I'm not necessarily sure that that's really going to happen, just considering that the other models are showing closer to a foot. And in the past, it seems that that has been the trend.
Absolutely. And of course, as we may or may not have mentioned previously, certainly something worth noting on these periodic live winter weather updates that we'll do. Again, these are going to be a fair bit shorter than our routine weather updates. Again, our routine weather updates being each week in our latest edition of GWP News Weekly. Again, that'll come out on Monday of each week. So for some more in-depth, nuanced coverage of your weather forecast throughout the week, you'll want to check out GWP News, but certainly in terms of some important sort of top information, a quick overview in terms of the winter weather, what to expect on that front. You want to stay tuned for future editions here of GWP Live, where again we will continue to be following this, but a couple of great places to stay tuned for that important information throughout the winter and, for that matter, throughout the year. Jake?
Yes, certainly so here. And so, as far as the snowfall that we've seen, again, this is kind of a quick overview of what we've seen so far this season. We've had about a half an inch so far this season in Nevada. That compares to 7.8 inches at this point last year. The seasonal average for the total is about 8 to 9 inches. Right now, I would say, just based on everything that we've seen, I'm going to go on a little bit of the lower end of a lot of the forecast and say that I'm expecting about 1 to 2 inches for Nevada and then up to an inch across Columbia. The timing on that would be Saturday, just pretty much on Saturday during the day and also into the overnight hours. And so earlier back in November, I made a prediction of about 10 inches here in Nevada with about nearly 20 inches in Columbia. That was my prediction just based on these averages and based on what we had. But again, considering where we were last year for both Nevada and Columbia, we're considerably lower than that, and we're lower than what we typically would be at for this time of year. So certainly we need the snow snow in order to make up for these averages, and also because we are in still a bit of a drought, especially across southwestern Missouri.
Absolutely, it would be nice to see some precipitation, certainly in light of the recent drought that we've seen, certainly here in our regional area, as you mentioned, Jake, southwest Missouri. So, certainly a bit of snow would help out with that. We haven't seen snow in some time. We, of course, had an unusually warm Christmas, missed out on a white Christmas. So, it would be great to see some of that before long. Jake?
Yes, and so also we've got about 3 minutes left in our live stream here. So once again, you can call in using that number 417-448-0819 if you have any additional questions. But we will be ending the live stream here in just a couple of minutes here. The last thing we're going to look at is the dangerous cold, because again, if the GFS model does play out and we don't see any snow here across the southwest Missouri and central Missouri, then either way, we're still going to have dangerously cold temperatures. And I will say, if the GFS model is right, temperatures will be even colder than if we do get the snow. The snow would actually make things a little bit warmer because that track would be a little bit further to the north. But as you'll see here, things are going to be pretty warm today and tomorrow into the 30s, 40s potentially even. So, but then as we go into Friday morning, temperatures dropping off into the teens. This is Friday morning at 6 o'clock. Friday, we will stay into the teens and 20s during the afternoon, and then the coldest air will move in Saturday night with actual temperatures being in the single digits, with wind chills being well below zero, 10, even 15 degrees below zero is possible. And you'll notice that with our extremely cold temperatures moving in, we're going to see those 20, 25, maybe even upwards of 30 degrees below average. And this is going to stick with us. So if we have any snow on the ground, it's probably not going to go anywhere for quite some time, as we're expecting to stay below average all the way through about Tuesday, a bit of a warm up. And then it is even possible at the end of next week that we could see another cool down as well, as indicated here by the National Weather Service as NOAA, showing that risk of hazardous temperatures, particularly through the end of the month, including the late part of next week, a high risk across the east, with here into Missouri, in that moderate risk from January 28th through February 1st. So that's kind of the time frame for that.
Absolutely. And I believe that about wraps up our weather update here on GWP Live. Again, no callers, it would seem, this time around, but not to fret. We will be here with GWP Live in the future. Have to call in then. Again, if you'd like to jot that number down for future reference, call in then. The number is 417-448-0819. Again, that's 417-448-0819. So over the course of the week, a bit of a cool down headed our way, it would seem. So have to stay warm out there. And with that, we conclude this broadcast. So until next time,
I'm Jacob Fulmer.
and I'm Isaac Hedges, host of GWP Live. From all of us at GWP Live and Great World Productions, good night and God bless.